Namaskar. I would like to begin by thanking the India International Centre, New Delhi, for inviting me to speak about such an important part of the heritage of our city, and one with which I have had the good fortune of being associated as a conservation consultant for about 2 decades. And indeed, these arresting images, which we'll all see during the course of the talk today, are not just an important part of our city, but also of the heritage of the entire world. But what would you describe these as? Giant slides? Intriguing pieces of sculpture? And the paradise of an early cubist, as a writer has termed them? Would you think of them as architecture at all? And what style of architecture? Would you agree with some tourists who have described these in the 20th century as a collection of weird buildings contorted beyond belief? These images, as many of us may know, together constitute what is popularly called the Jantar Mantar. The Jantar Mantar is one of the most visible symbols of Delhi. It is probably the most photogenic and certainly the least understood sites of Delhi, repeatedly used to advertise the city's attractions. The structures in it cannot be described simply. Not a fort, not a tomb, not even a tower. Some people even quibble at calling these huge structures buildings. The hesitation in doing so is understandable when you consider that all the famous architectural monuments built before or during the same time as the Jantar Mantar, and even the more unusual pieces of architecture that followed it, are quite discernibly recognizable as buildings. In contrast, these pieces of construction defy any easy categorization. Their fantastic forms have inspired and continue to inspire all sorts of creations, from street art to high art, from national symbols to international ones. These, for instance, are patterns in stone and tile on the walls and floors of the subway opposite the IIT Delhi, photographed in March 2010. Though somewhat simplified and childlike, they are obviously derived from the structures that one may still see at the Delhi Jantar Mantar. And this is a special 2 rupee coin released on the occasion of the 1982 Asiad. It has a simplified view of the Mishra Yantra, which is associated especially with the Delhi Jantar Mantar. This yantra was also the logo of the 9th Asian Games held at Delhi in 1982. And this is an image from an article in an architectural magazine published from London in 1935. It shows a structure erected in the early 19th century in a pleasure park near Paris, which the author believes, and I quote, was certainly designed from an illustration of the Mishra Yantra, end of quote. Incidentally, the famous artist Anish Kapoor also professes to be mystified as well as greatly inspired by the forms of the Jantar Mantar, especially the Mishra Yantra, though he calls it the Shri Yantra. The Jantar Mantar also figures in many of the drawings, paintings, and photographs by European artists who visited India from the 18th to the 20th centuries. Notwithstanding its evident popularity and repeated representation, the Jantar Mantar has always been somewhat of a mystery. Before I try to unravel some of this mystery, let us orient ourselves correctly. This is the view from the present-day entrance to the Jantar Mantar site. However, if you were a resident of Delhi in the 18th, the 19th centuries, or if you were a European visitor who had come to record it for their catalogues of drawings and photographs, you would never have seen the Jantar Mantar from this perspective. Where we enter the Jantar Mantar site today is actually the back of the complex. This entrance is only about a century old and dates to the time when British New Delhi was built. If you were a visitor or resident of Delhi in the early 20th century, before the construction of British New Delhi or during that time, you would have entered the observatory complex directly from the side where the Sansad Marg or the Parliament Street is located today. And in this archival image, you may see a low boundary wall around the observatory complex with a small gate and railway tracks laid to transport construction material to the Raisina building site in front of the wall and the gate. However, this is also not the original entrance. The original entrance, which, as I surmise from my research and analysis, would have been from the side opposite the present-day Sansad Marg or Parliament Street, from the structure marked as a temple in this map. And this is the Peru Mandir, which is still run by priests from Rajasthan. And originally, all this was part of the area of the Rajas of Amber, and entry to the instruments of the Jantar Mantar would have been preceded by entrance to the temple complex, where the users of the observatory would have first paid their respects to the deity and then proceeded further into where the instruments were located. And this plan, of course, which dates from the time of British New Delhi, would not have existed then. And all this area was actually a suburb of Jaisinghpura, which was located on the outskirts of the then capital city of Shah Jahanabad, which was located between the river Yamuna and the boundary walls, which enclosed Shah Jahanabad. But despite the difference in orientation, the commonality between then and now is the fact that the Jantar Mantar has always intrigued visitors as well as residents. And information on it in the public domain has always been scanty, often contradictory, and occasionally incorrect. There is no unanimity about who got it built, when it was constructed, its name, and even its purpose and value. Though originally referred to simply as the yantra, it has been described and called variously through its existence as the Yantar Mandir, the Yantar Mantra, and from the 19th century onwards as the Jantar Mantar. Its purpose and value are equally disputed. Some people consider the Jantar Mantar as an integral part of the scientific heritage of the world. Others dismiss it as a whimsy of a king. Some writers suggest that they are not instruments of astronomy at all, but are tantric yantras. Of those who do recognize them as astronomical instruments, some say they're nothing more than copies of the instruments at the 15th century Samarkand Observatory. Some think they're pure developments of the Hindu school of astronomy, and others claim they are completely inspired or derived from Persian and Greek schools of astronomy. Even the date of construction is disputed, and there are conflicting accounts about who got these structures built. This, for instance, is the cover of the graphic version of one of the Feluda mysteries, written by Satyajit Ray, the famous film director. In this particular episode of the story, Feluda's companions, his cousin Topshe and his friend Lalmohan Ganguly, have come to the Delhi Jantar Mantar. While admiring the observatory, they marvel at this proof of Raja Man Singh's royal style of doing things. Now, Raja Man Singh lived about 450 years ago and was one of Emperor Akbar's trusted generals. Satyajit Ray, who was reputedly fanatically meticulous in his research, in ascribing the construction of the Jantar Mantar to Raja Man Singh, probably relied on earlier accounts, such as an article by Sir Robert Barker in the Transactions of the British Royal Society, published in 1777, which claimed that the Delhi Jantar Mantar was built in the 16th century during Emperor Akbar's reign. The historian Dharampal, in his path-breaking work on Indian science and technology in the 18th century, also forcefully puts forward his reasons for believing that the Jantar Mantars were erected in the 16th century. However, if you visit the Jantar Mantar, you may notice this, a plaque inserted in the west wall of one of the yantras after conservation work on it in 1910. This plaque gives the Delhi Jantar Mantar's date of construction as 1710. On the other hand, the ASI, the Archaeological Survey of India, the present custodians of the site, believe that the Delhi Jantar Mantar's date of construction was in the 1720s. And so it goes on. So what I am going to focus on today is to clarify some basic facts about the Delhi Jantar Mantar. Simply put, this is what I'll talk about. Who was it built by? Why was it built? When was it built? What are the main instruments in it and what is their purpose? What is the value of the Delhi Jantar Mantar today? And therefore, finally, what is the manner in which we should be regarding and conserving the Jantar Mantar? So who was it built by? The Delhi Jantar Mantar is the first in the series of 5 similar observatories made at Banaras, Ujjain, Jaipur, Mathura, and of course Delhi. Though some accounts ascribe its construction to the Mughal Emperor Akbar's time and to Raja Man Singh in the 16th century, it is most likely that the Delhi Jantar Mantar, as well as the later ones, were built in the reign of the Mughal Emperor Muhammad Shah and on the initiative of Raja Savai Jai Singh of Amer, who employed his state astronomers, religious gurus, and expert masons to get them built. How can we be so sure? Well, the first available accounts of the Jantar Mantars by travelers, visitors, or court historians are from the 18th century, during and after Jai Singh's rule. Savai Jai Singh himself states explicitly in the preface to the new astronomical tables that he dedicated to Muhammad Shah Rangila that he, Jai Singh, constructed in Shahjahanabad several of the instruments of an observatory. Apart from this explicit claim, Savai Jai Singh's consistent and recorded interest in astronomy and mathematics, right from the time that he was a young boy, was far more than that of any of his ancestors or descendants. All through his life, he conducted, funded, and participated in experiments on astronomy. And all this leads us to the conclusion that the Jantar Mantars were established due to his active patronage. Now, when was the Delhi Jantar Mantar, the first of all the Jantar Mantars established by Savai Jai Singh, built? Most of the instruments of the Delhi Jantar Mantar were built in all probability between the years 1721 and 1724, when the political relations between Savai Jai Singh and the rulers of the Mughal Empire were most favorable. And Savai Jai Singh's schedule allowed him to remain in the Mughal imperial capital of Shahjahanabad continuously for 2 years. This was soon after the crowning of Emperor Muhammad Shah Rangila. The first few instruments that were made or used at the Delhi Jantar Mantar were of metal And the massive built structures that we see here today were made after Jai Singh decided that metal instruments did not suit his purpose. However, the Mishra Yantra, which is the last yantra to be made here, was not built in the reign of Savai Jai Singh, but in that of his son, Savai Madho Singh, 30 years after the rest of the Delhi Jantar Mantar. The date of 1710, that is sometimes advanced as the date of establishment of the observatory, does not seem possible, since in 1710, the Mughal emperor was Aurangzeb's son and successor, Bahadur Shah I, whose miniature painting you see here, who was a sworn enemy of Jai Singh. And after 1727, Jai Singh deliberately chose to remain in his own principality of Amer and concentrated on the establishment of his new city of Jaipur and the Jantar Mantar there. Thus, the time between 1720 to 1724 seems most likely for the establishment of the Delhi Jantar Mantar, the first of the 5 observatories established on the initiative of Savai Jai Singh. Now, why was it built? The Delhi Jantar Mantar was built to take accurate observations to update the older astronomical tables on the basis of which the yearly calendars were made in the Mughal Empire. A set of new astronomical tables were devised on the basis of the Delhi Jantar Mantar, the Ziji Muhammad Shahi. This was dedicated by Savai Jai Singh to Emperor Muhammad Shah Rangila and was used to plan out forthcoming religious, agricultural, social, and cultural activities throughout the Mughal Empire. The information in it was also utilized in the Panchangs, the traditional Hindu almanacs listing the different festivals, seasons, positions of the moon, eclipses, and other such information. Such knowledge was put to practical use not only for marking time and seasonal changes, but also for accurate foretelling of natural calamities. Now, how was this built? This is the first, as I mentioned, of all the Jantar Mantars. So most of the yantras that we see here are original creations of Savai Jai Singh and his team. They were devised and built painstakingly after making many small working models in wood, stone, or metal. The appropriate site was then chosen on Savai Jai Singh's ancestral land, Jaisinghpura, on the outskirts of Shahjahanabad. The ground beneath each instrument was excavated and leveled perfectly with the help of channels filled with water, as can still be seen at the Jaipur Jantar Mantar. It was then marked out with north, south, and east, west directions as detailed out in traditional astronomy manuals, and then constructed in local stone and lime mortar. Savai Jai Singh employed scholars from all faiths, as well as his state astronomers, his religious gurus, and expert masons to get the Delhi Jantar Mantar built. They built the instruments here partly below the surrounding ground level so as to make them stable and so that observations of the horizon would not be disturbed, and lessened the weight of the huge structures by scooping out arched openings within the walls, and finally plastered and rendered them in smooth white lime and carefully marked them with measuring scales. So what are the instruments themselves and what is their purpose? Of the instruments that still exist at the Delhi Jantar Mantar, the 3 main ones from Savai Jai Singh's time are the Samrat Yantra, the Jai Prakash Yantra, and the Ram Yantra. A 4th instrument, the Shasthamsa Yantra, from the same time is no longer accessible. Located adjacent to the Samrat, it was sealed up in the conservation work of 1910. And the last masonry instrument here, the Mishra Yantra, as mentioned earlier, was not part of the original range of instruments and was built later, perhaps as a demonstration instrument. And it was a composite yantra which consisted of about 5 instruments within the structure. Now, basically, all these instruments were designed to measure solar time or the positions of objects in space. Of the three main yantras, the Samrat, the central and the most imposing, was used to measure solar time as well as to measure the sun's declination. The Jai Prakash Yantra was meant to measure local and universal coordinates of celestial bodies. It also had a secondary function of measuring solar time. The Ram Yantra was meant to measure local coordinates, in other words, the altitude and the azimuth of celestial bodies. With these yantras, Jai Singh's team measured the positions of stars, the moon, and the planets in the sky for about 7 years and recorded exactly when these measurements were taken. They then used these recordings to update older star positions. The instruments at the Jantar Mantar were also important for Jai Singh's personal ritual practices. He not only performed daily yagnas, but also conducted special ones to celebrate major successes or to initiate new ventures, such as the construction of his new city of Savai Jaipur. Observational astronomy in India, in fact, can be traced thousands of years back to the requirement for such rituals in the Vedic times. A temple dedicated to the child Bhairo, the Bal Bhairo Mandir, still exists east of the Jantar Mantar. This temple was part of its original area, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, and is positioned in line with what I surmise to be the original entrance of the observatory and its most important yantra, the Samrat. In the larger cultural context, in the 18th century, all over the subcontinent, not only were religious events scheduled on the basis of such sightings, but also there are recorded instances of dates of important political and administrative events being deferred or preponed by the Mughal rulers based on the prediction of eclipses and positions of the new moon. I'll briefly describe in a simplified form one of the functions of the Samrat Yantra, the largest instrument of the Delhi Jantar Mantar, and the second largest equinoctial sundial in the world, and the oldest such sundial in the world. So the main function of the Samrat was to measure solar time, and it tracks time through the apparent movement of the sun. How does it do so? Well, basically, the yantra is made up of a right angle triangle at the center of a semicircle. The triangle is aligned north-south and is inclined to the ground at the same angle as the latitude of Delhi, 28 degrees 37 minutes north. The semicircle is perpendicular to the triangle and thus to the Earth's axis, making it in the plane of the equator, and thus the name equatorial sundial. During the day when the sun shines, the shadow of the triangle falls on the semicircle. Just as we read time on a mechanical clock or a watch by observing the positions of the hands of the clock or watch, similarly, we can read time from the Samrat during the day by seeing where the shadow falls on the semicircle. The difference is that the Samrat is a huge clock. Its triangular part is as high as a modern 7-story building, and its semicircle is correspondingly large. So instead of putting this clock in our houses or wearing it on our wrists, we actually climb up it and read its divisions to see what the time is. Since the sun appears to move from east to west in the sky, its shadow moves across from west to east on the dials of the Samrat. The western half of the semicircle, which is the one towards the present-day Parliament Street or Sansad Marg, originally measured time from 6 a.m. to 12 noon. The shadow on the eastern half of the semicircle was meant to measure time from 12 noon to 6 p.m. in the evening. And skilled observers in Jai Singh's time could measure apparent solar time with the Samrat to an accuracy of 2 seconds. Today, most of the Samrat's original markings are missing, but if they still existed, this is how they would have been used. So originally, the two parts of the semicircle were each divided into equally spaced time markings of 15 ghatikas and angle markings of 90 degrees. The topmost point of the semicircle, corresponding to 90 degrees, was marked as the 15th Ghatika, equivalent to 6 a.m. or 6 p.m., while the lowermost point, corresponding to 0 degrees, was a 0 Ghatika, equivalent to 12 noon. These were subdivided such that the smallest time division measured 2 seconds. By observing the position of the shadow edge with reference to these subdivisions, therefore, observers could measure solar time very accurately. Thus, what is the value of the Jantar Mantar today? We must recognize that the Delhi Jantar Mantar, as the first of the 18th century observatories constructed on the initiative of Savai Jai Singh and containing many original instruments, is one of the most unique sets of buildings in the world. It has immense value as an educational and a cultural resource. Jai Singh wished to spur scientific interest amongst his people and to popularize observational astronomy, not limited to an exclusive band of specialists. So all the instruments that we see here today, though they are very complex pieces of construction, are relatively simple to use once the principle is understood. Programs by astronomers with school children and amateurs conducted at the Delhi Jantar Mantar have shown the success of Jai Singh's premise. No other instruments anywhere in the world can demonstrate the movement of the Earth and the planets with such clarity. No other instruments are so easily accessible to an ordinary person. They are, in fact, particularly suited not just to observe the skies, which is, of course, their primary function, but also to demonstrate principles of spherical trigonometry, physics, mathematics, and geography. They also serve as a reminder that in any time or any age, individuals who have convictions can still make lasting contributions. However, our understanding of the value of the Delhi Jantar Mantar so far has been mainly derived from the largely subjective accounts of science and technology in India by European amateur and professional researchers from the mid-18th century onwards. By this time, it was more than 150 years since the British East India Company had engaged in planned exploitation under the name of commerce, resulting in the loss of much of our traditional scientific and artistic knowledge. Later, when the British Empire became a reality, the prevailing outlook of most researchers also became influenced by their belief in the superiority of their race, culture, and religion. It is with this background that we must understand why such earlier researchers have downplayed or dismissed the scientific value of the Jantar Mantars. In actual fact, with these very same yantras, Jai Singh's astronomers were able to take many useful observations, reveal new data, and correct the errors not just in older tables used in the Indian subcontinent, but also in prevalent European ones. The Delhi Jantar Mantar thus must be appreciated for its value in measuring time and plotting positions of objects in the sky, instead of seeing it merely as a collection of intriguing architectural shapes or just as an archaeological monument. And so, what is the manner in which we should regard the Delhi Jantar Mantar today, and how should we conserve it for the future? The Delhi Jantar Mantar has in the past been conserved as an urban garden in the tradition of an English landscape rather than as an important Indian observatory. Its first major conservation exercise in the beginning of the 20th century, about 150 years after its establishment, though undertaken with the help of the court astronomer of Jaipur and funds from the then Jaipur Raja, was supervised by British engineers who chose to conserve its yantras as a collection of monuments rather than as precise instruments of astronomy, and changed some of their features in doing so. They were regarded and presented as architectural follies amidst a plantation of tall trees. The foreground to the Jantar Mantar has also been taken over shortly after this conservation exercise, as we see, by the building of British Imperial New Delhi, which appropriated much of Jai Singh's ancestral land to make Connaught Place and the roads leading up to Parliament House. The immediate surroundings of Jantar Mantar have since changed further with the construction of many buildings surrounding it. These interventions have reduced the area and the function and even the perception of the observatory. Today, we see the Jantar Mantar quite differently from what it was in the 18th century. We enter it from a completely different direction from what Savai Jai Singh did and from what it was originally meant to be entered from. And we often miss the point of its construction completely. It is true that the Delhi Observatory has not been used for purposes of astronomy consistently for more than 200 years. It is also true that most of the calibrations made by Savai Jai Singh's master masons have been lost. The skyline around the Jantar Mantar has been taken over by tall trees and even taller buildings. We naturally cannot change all of these. However, it is still possible to revive the function of the yantras at the Delhi Jantar Mantar, which even in this reduced state contain much of the original built components. They can still be effectively used to measure local time, observe stars, and calculate positions of celestial objects. As Dr. Ratnashri, the director of the Nehru Planetarium, has said, and I quote, 300 years after they were built, they are still the easiest access of doing celestial coordinate measurements. It is this aspect of the Jantar Mantar that must be reinstated. For this, it is imperative that the yantras must be physically conserved using building materials compatible with the original materials used by Jai Singh's masons, as well as by accurately recalibrating the measuring surfaces. For instance, the practice of resurfacing the yantras with stone and cement-based paints is completely at variance with the original lime plaster. And this not only compromises the structure in terms of its the water ingress that happens due to the cracks in the joints and the cement-based plaster, but it also interferes with the function of the yantras. It is necessary to understand that the function of the yantras is the most important. This is why they were constructed. And any conservation which ignores their historical function or jeopardizes it in any way is self-defeating. It is only by bringing the yantras back into sustained public use that we will be conserving the spirit and form of the Jantar Mantars. And this is what I have come to realize due to my long association with the Jantar Mantar redevelopment project, which is a partnership venture between the ASI, the Archaeological Survey of India, and the APJ Surendra Park hotels. The conservation philosophy enunciated in the feasibility report I prepared at the very beginning of the project in 1999. And these are some photographs of the site as it looked in 1999 before the project began. So the conservation philosophy stressed and categorically stated that instead of the earlier approach of conserving the Delhi Jantar Mantar as an archaeological monument, its conservation must be based on a recognition of its functional importance and on the reinstatement of its astronomy-related function. This is what we have stressed in all our efforts and recommendations through the research and conservation work done over the course of the past 2 decades of the project. For instance, the lighting at the Delhi Jantar Mantar, which was undertaken as part of the project, was designed and implemented without causing any visual or functional obstruction to the yantras. And these very small stone structures that you see are actually the points where the lighting fixtures are housed. And yet it achieved optimum illumination levels, as you can see in these photographs. Similarly, the signage panels were designed to communicate a great deal of essential information to understand the yantras, but with minimal proportions themselves, so that the foreground is not disturbed by their presence or by their installation or by their maintenance. The visitor movement plan proposed in the feasibility report, whenever it is implemented, will also ensure that visitors are led to move around through the planning of the width and the positioning of the pathways around the edge of the site instead of around them, to allow enough visual and spatial buffer to limit involuntary or voluntary vandalism to the yantras. And the landscape design as well was generated from the proportions and requirements of the yantras. It frees up the foreground and recommends plantation that is ecologically and structurally appropriate for the observatory complex instead of the tall Cuban royal palms that still dot most of its area. And as a pilot project within the larger Jantar Mantar redevelopment project, it was proposed that the Mishra Yantra, which was probably always a demonstration tool, and which has come to be linked so strongly with the Delhi Jantar Mantar as to almost become its face, should be the first to be reinstated functionally. To this end, extensive preliminary work ranging from plaster investigations to trial excavations to determine the original ground levels and compositions of the finishes, as well as archival research at the National Museum, the ASI Library, and the photo archives, and measured and conditioned surveys of the yantra were done. Public outreach activities involving, among others, the Delhi Planetarium were also planned on a regular basis to allow citizens to experience how the yantras worked and the fact that their function was their most important reason for being established. Though the actual physical conservation of the yantra as recommended in the project has not been implemented, the fact that the ASI is now seeking to restore the functional attributes of another yantra at the Delhi Jantar Mantar, the Jai Prakash, is a measure of the success of the project's objectives in bringing about a change in how the Jantar Mantar is viewed and how it should be conserved. To share the knowledge gained through the project and to guide visitors into the context of the yantras, their function, their transformation, and the astronomy and social and cultural reasons that underlay their establishment, a book which helps visitors to understand all this was also released as part of the project. And the book release it involved and invited citizens of the city so that they could actively be part of this exercise of removing the misconceptions about the Delhi Jantar Mantar and helping to disseminate more correct information about it. In keeping with Savai Jai Singh's wish that the instruments be used by anyone interested in the study of astronomy, I hope that an awareness of the real value of the Jantar Mantar through all these collective efforts, and perhaps through this talk as well, may move all of us to ensure that we never have a situation where we desecrate or vandalize our heritage in any guise or any form. And instead, we are able to learn from them to discover the many fascinating aspects of our linked universe and ourselves. Thank you for being on this brief journey through the Delhi Jantar Mantar with me and for investigating its historical as well as its functional context and why it appears the way it does today and what we need to do to ensure that we are able to conserve the spirit and form of the Jantar Mantar in the future. I'd like to acknowledge the Archaeological Survey of India, the National Museum, New Delhi, the Victoria and Albert Museum, London, and the Hindustan Times, New Delhi for some of the images used in this talk. I'd also like to thank the Archaeological Survey of India and the members with whom I interacted during the course of the project and through whose help we've been able to do a lot of the work. And last but not the least, the APJ Surendra Park Hotels and Priya Paul, on whose initiative this entire project was undertaken, and during the course of it, I personally, as well as everybody who's been associated with the project, have come to learn so much about these fascinating instruments at the Delhi Jantar Mantar. And I do hope that some of that understanding and that appreciation has been conveyed through this talk, so that all of us may work together to ensure that we are able to use the yantras of the Delhi Jantar Mantar as they were conceived by Savai Jai Singh and his team. Thank you. Namaskar.